What makes Mencken so different from other libertarians like Rothbard is that Mencken had no expectation whatsoever of being influential. But this did not in any way stunt Mencken's productivity and passion as a libertarian theorist and shit-stirrer. Mencken considered politics a genre of entertainment, and he considered the corruption merely as ad breaks. He thought government pathetic, obscene, and criminal, but not hideous, intolerable, or unsightly. As Mencken said of his libertarianism, quote, "My business is not prognosis, but diagnosis. I am not engaged in therapeutics, but in pathology. I am not, in fact, protesting against anything. I am simply describing something. Not so much, not even in sorrow, but simply as a specialist in human depravity. Such spectacles do not make me indignant. They simply interest me immensely, as a pathologist, say, is interested in a beautiful gastric ulcer. It is perhaps a strange taste, that is, in a country of reformers, but there it is," unquote. So the phrase "specialist in human depravity" is brilliant. Think back to all the speakers we've heard over the weekend, and all the great libertarian writers. I think it's more descriptive to call them all specialists in human depravity than economists or legal theorists or historians or whatever. But Mencken's low expectations are more justified than Rothbard's high expectations of future libertarian revolution. In the 1965 essay, The Prospects of Liberty, in the first issue of Rothbard's journal, Left and Right, Murray Rothbard writes, quote, "While the short-run prospects for liberty at home and abroad may seem dim, the proper attitude for the libertarian to take is that of an unquenchable long-run optimism. For the libertarian, the main task of the present epoch is to cast off his needless and debilitating pessimism, to set his sights on long-run victory, and to set out on the road to its attainment," unquote. Now, to me, this is the most cliched, romantic rubbish. It is just like saying that positive thinking helps cure cancer. In fact, it's even worse than that, because Rothbard is saying things will get better in the long run, even though they won't in the short term. And even worse, it shows that Rothbard totally ignored the fact that Mencken's pessimism was entirely based in reason. It was not a baseless attitude. Incidentally, all of Mencken's many book-length biographies have been written, and they all ignore this fact too. They look at his pessimism as an attitude, not based in reason. However, what Rothbard said makes perfect sense if your aim in being a libertarian activist is exclusively to persuade and influence others. If persuading and influencing is your exclusive aim, then you must be optimistic that you will persuade and influence, otherwise you would not be a libertarian activist. But why would you be optimistic that you can persuade and influence others? Here are some common answers that many romantic libertarians use, accompanied by a Menckenian response. So, romantic libertarians like to say that the internet age is different because now everyone has such easy access to libertarian propaganda. But Menckenians think that is more than cancelled out by there also being easy access to status propaganda. Romantic libertarians like to say that government intervention has become so extreme that the economic situation will result in people finally seeing the light and becoming libertarians. But Menckenians think it is more likely that hyperinflations and depressions result in increased government intervention and more misplaced blame on capitalism. Romantic libertarians like to say that slavery was abolished, even though the so-called realists said we should just regulate the slave trade. So they use this to show that we should be radical in abolishing taxes, government departments, etc., as they amount to forced labour, which is slavery. But you know what this argument also says? It admits that actually we still have slavery today. Romantic libertarians like to say that the minimum wage is a great example of economic reasoning and the best way to successfully introduce people to libertarian thought. But what the case of the minimum wage also proves is that an ever-growing number of people, a number of countries all around the world are implementing and increasing the minimum wage, including Hong Kong quite recently, the last holdout, or one of the last. So in light of the widespread and growing popularity of so obvious a calamity as the minimum wage, how can anyone be optimistic for any libertarian progress in more complicated areas? Libertarians often show that governments of the past that are today considered to be tyrannical and unpopular, even by the establishment, share the same characteristics with popular governments today that are considered to be free and popular. With this argument, romantic libertarians hope to bring about a widespread enlightenment, which will lead to a more just, free and prosperous society. But their observation also teaches something quite different, which libertarians often fail to acknowledge. As Mencken pointed out, quote, "The fact is that some of the things that men and women have desired most ardently for thousands of years are not nearer realization today than they were in the time of Ramesses, and that there is not the slightest reason for believing that they will lose their coyness on any near tomorrow. Plans for hurrying them on have been tried since the beginning. Plans for forcing them overnight are in copious and antagonistic operation today, and yet they continue to hold off and elude us, and the chances are that they will keep on holding off and eluding us." To further communicate that Mencken's pessimism was justified, I think the most effective thing would be for us to see that Albert J. Nock did not believe in the remnant. Speaking to the remnant is long-term romanticism, which in a way is the most extreme form of hope-fueled romanticism. And Albert J. Nock is the author of Isaiah's Job, the most referenced essay putting forward being influential in the long term and expecting that people will find you and they will be convinced by what you say eventually. But before I quote Nock to show that he himself did not believe in the remnant, Nock's favourite author, Marcus Aurelius, offered the best criticism of those libertarian romantics like Murray Rothbard who believe in the remnant and are optimists for long-term libertarian progress. Aurelius said, quote, "They are misunderstood by their contemporaries, the people whose lives they share, but they expect to be understood by posterity, people they've never met and never will. That's what they set their hearts on. You might as well be upset at not being a hero to your great-grandfather," end quote. And Mencken made a very similar comment to Marcus Aurelius when he said, quote, "There is a notion that judgments of living artists are impossible. They are bound to be corrupted, we are told, by prejudice, false perspective, mob emotion, error. The question whether this or that man is great or small is one which only posterity can answer. But this is a silly begging of the question, for doesn't posterity also make mistakes?" Unquote. So because of how popular among libertarian circles the myth of Nock as optimist and reformer is, I will now read out some short passages showing that Nock himself did not believe in Isaiah's Job. So I think it's an important thing to emphasise that Nock himself did not believe in Isaiah's Job. And in the essay Isaiah's Job itself, this is what he said. He said, quote, "If I were young and had the notion of embarking on the prophetical line, I would certainly take up this branch of the business," which aiming for long-term influence and expecting that those who appreciate your work will eventually find you and eventually lead to progress in a libertarian direction. So, and therefore, I have no hesitation about recommending it as a career for anyone in that position, unquote. So, but obviously Nock was not young when he wrote that essay, and he was not interested in embarking on a career in the prophetical line. So when people talk of Nock's remnant, they do not talk of a Nock that wrote the remnant of a remnant that Nock wrote intentionally for. So here are some passages. Here's two passages showing that Nock was thoroughly pessimistic about the prospects for liberty. So, quote, "The only thing that the psychically human being can do to improve society is to present society with one improved unit. Very few among mankind have either the force of intellect to manage this method intelligently or the force of character to apply it constantly. Hence, if one regards mankind as being what they are, the chances seem to be that the deceptively easier way will continue to prevail among them throughout an indefinitely long future. It is easy to prescribe improvement for others. It is easy to organise something, to institutionalise this or that, to pass laws, multiply bureaucratic agencies, form pressure groups, start revolutions, change forms of government, tinker at political theory. But the fact that these experiments have been tried unsuccessfully in every conceivable combination for 6,000 years has not noticeably impaired a credulous, unintelligent willingness to keep on trying them again and again. This being so, it seems highly probable that the hope for any significant improvement of society must be postponed." End quote. And here's one more Nock paragraph. Sometimes people who knew my politics have wondered that I do not crusade for it or even say much about it. he does, but he doesn't call to action at the end of every essay. But much more that a sound economic system is necessary. You have to have sound people to work it. The wise social philosophers were those who merely hung up their ideas and left them hanging for men to look at or to pass by as they chose. Jesus and Socrates did not even trouble to write theirs out, and Marcus Aurelius wrote his only in crabbed memoranda for his own use, never thinking anyone else would see them." End quote. So this passage mentions Marcus Aurelius, whom we quoted earlier. Nock was a really big fan of his. Here's one more Marcus Aurelius passage. Quote, "Evil, the same old thing. Whatever happens, keep this in mind. It's the same old thing, from one end of the world to the other. It fills the history books, ancient and modern, and the cities and the houses too. Familiar, transient. Look at the past, empire succeeding empire, and from that extrapolate the future. The same thing. No escape from the rhythm of events, which is why observing life for 40 years is as good as 1,000. Would you really see anything new?" So in conclusion, Menckenians might hope that libertarian progress will be made, even if that would unfortunately compromise our enjoyment watching the greedy and gullible, passionate people passionately support the unprincipled government. But there's no reason to expect any progress. But to repeat, that does not mean there are not many other reasons for being a libertarian and shit stirrer. And that's all for me. Now, Vinay.